It is a great honor to be able to introduce to you Mr. Chad Frischmann. He is the Vice President and Research Director of Project Drawdown. It is an incredible book, #1 environmental book in the world. And Chad, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really, really excited to be here today. What I think is really an exceptional conference. I mean, how many times do we have a conference on climate communications? Right? This is something that's been lacking for 25 years, so I'm really happy that we're having it today. So to start with, I'd just like to ask the room, who here has already heard of Drawdown? Wow, okay, so a lot of you. But for those of you who don't, or haven't yet to hear about Drawdown, I want to give you a quick definition. Drawdown is that point in time when atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases begin to decline on a year-to-year basis. It's that point when we take out more greenhouse gases than we put in to Earth's atmosphere. Now, the proposition here is when that happens, we can stop global warming and start the process of reversing it. But more than just a technical definition, Drawdown is really a new way of thinking about and acting on global warming. It's that marker on the horizon, pointing us towards where we want to go, towards a future that we actually want, a future where reversing global warming is possible. Now, we're all concerned about climate change, and we should be, right? But climate change is really a complicated response of the system, Earth's system, our atmosphere, our oceans and terrestrial systems, our biodiversity, even our human systems, a response to an underlying problem. That's global warming, increasing temperatures caused by human-induced emissions. So how do we start to solve the problem underlying climate change? How do we begin the process of reversing global warming? The only way we know how is to draw down or avoid putting greenhouse gases up and to pull down what's already there. Now, it sounds really daunting, right? It sounds maybe even impossible. But the thing about it, humanity is brilliant. Humanity already knows what to do, and nature is resilient. And together, there are real, workable technologies and practices that exist today that when taken together can achieve drawdown. What we lack is not the technology or the financial power to do so. We lack the will to move farther and faster than we ever thought we needed to. And so we need to change the way we talk about and act on global warming, to move away from a paradigm of fear, confusion, and panic, which only leads to apathy and an indifference to the status quo, to a new model of understanding and possibility, because when we mix understanding and possibility together, we create opportunities to change the way we do business, to create that future that we want. Now, I lead a team of researchers from around the world, and together we've mapped, modeled, and analyzed 100 solutions to reversing global warming. 80 of these solutions already exist today. They're already scaling. They're already economically viable and scientifically valid. And together those 80 can achieve drawdown in time. 20 are what we call coming attractions. These are innovations that are on the pipeline. And when they come online, will dramatically accelerate our progress towards that future that we want. These are solutions that do one or more of three things. Replace existing fossil fuel-based energy generation with clean, renewable sources. To reduce consumption through technological efficiencies and behavior change. And to biosequester carbon in our plants, biomass, and soils through a process we all learn in secondary school, the magic of photosynthesis. This is how drawdown happens. It's through a combination of these three mechanisms. But how do we get there? This is a list of the top 20 solutions that come from Drawdown's research. Now remember, there are 80 existing solutions, so this is just a snapshot of the top 20. Now, it's quite eclectic, so take a few seconds just to look over that list. And I'll go over into some detail in a second. We have things like the usual suspects, right? Wind turbines and solar panels. And we have some unusual suspects as well. Educating girls and silvopasture. So let's break it down a little bit. To the right of the slide, you're going to see gigatons, figures in gigatons. This represents the total carbon dioxide equivalent avoided or pulled down from the atmosphere over a 30-year period from 2020 to 2050. Now what that means, carbon dioxide equivalents, that means we add up all the carbon dioxide, methane, fluorinated gases, nitrous oxide, etc., together and compare these as apples to apples. So one of the first things to notice about this list is really interesting. When we think about climate solutions, at least when I think about climate solutions, I should say when I used to think about climate solutions, first thing that comes to my mind, solar panels, wind turbines, right? The usual suspects. What's interesting with this list is that only 5 of the top 20 solutions relate to electricity. Now, it's incredibly important, electricity solutions. Electricity generation accounts for up to 25 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's huge. But there's up to 75% more emissions out there coming from different sources. So incredibly important. But what was really surprising, honestly, to us, was that 8 of the top 20 solutions relate to food. Now, the climate impact of food may come as a shock to some people, but if we think about it, think of all the emissions that are associated with producing that food, packaging that food. Think about all the emissions associated with producing glass and cardboard, etc. Processing, distribution, cooking them on our ovens and the stoves, and then ultimately wasting it. All of that is emissions embodied in every seed or every drop of oil. So what these results show us are that the choices we make every day about what we produce, consume, and purchase are perhaps the most substantial solutions every one of us can take every day to reversing global warming. Now, how we manage our land is also incredibly important. By protecting our forests, wetlands, and currently degraded land, we safeguard, expand, and we can create new carbon sinks that directly draw down carbon. This is how drawdown happens, right? Think of trees as giant sticks of carbon. And as we grow trees, they become safeguarded. They become safe and sinks. That's what we call carbon sinks. So it's incredibly important to how we manage our ecosystems. But what's interesting is when we take food and land together, 12 of the top 20 solutions relate to how and why we use land. Now this fundamentally shifts traditional thinking on climate solutions from energy and electricity to food and land. Now let's go to the top of the list, because there's also kind of a big shocker for us, right? Who would have thought refrigeration management would leap to the top of that list? Now what we're talking about here is properly managing leakage and destroying at the end of life of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are used by air conditioners and refrigerators across the world to cool the air. Now, by properly managing them, we prevent them from escaping into the atmosphere. And why is that important? Because hydrofluorocarbons are hundreds to thousands of times more potent to greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So even small amounts have a huge impact on global warming. And we have a precedent to solve this. It's called the Montreal Protocol. Do you remember that? Right? What a landmark international agreement that was, to prohibit the production and use of chlorofluorocarbons. But they were replaced by hydrofluorocarbons. We replaced a problem with an ozone depletion substance with a global warming, with the high global warming potentials. So we replace one with the other. But the reality is that we have natural refrigeration alternatives, rental refrigerant alternatives, and different methods that we can be using today, that exist today. So we can shift this, and there was a landmark agreement called the Kigali Agreement in 2016 that called for the phase out over time. But what's interesting is if we sped up that phase out and limited that production and use today, up to 120 to 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents could be avoided from entering the atmosphere over 30 years. Truly astounding. So I want to remind you this is only 20 of 80 solutions, and all 80 are incredibly important. But you may be wondering how we came to these calculations, right? Well, first of all, we collect a lot of data. We call ourselves a meta-analysis. What that means is we scour the world for peer-reviewed and widely cited data for all of these solutions, every input and every prognostication, every future prediction that we use for these solutions. We scour the world and collect data external to us. It's a secondary analysis. We collect that, we create statistical analyses around each input that we use. I call them ranges of possibility. And we take a conservative approach. We take the mean of those ranges. We're not a critic. We're not an advocate. We don't take the high or low depending on what we want the data to show us. We take a mean of as much data as possible for everything we put into our models. And all of that data is then entered into our models and ambitiously but plausibly projected into the future. And guess what? Compared to what we would have to do anyway. So take that onshore wind turbine at 84 gigatons. That's a result of the electricity generated from wind farms compared to what we would have to be producing from a combination of coal, oil, or gas. This is what we would have to do anyway. So we have a solution in front of us that can replace that. Emissions and add it up. The same process is used for heat pumps compared to furnaces, from industrial compared to regenerative agriculture, from protecting versus cutting down our forests. Now, all of these results are then integrated within and across sectors and systems because no solution operates in isolation. So once we integrate them to account for double counting, interaction effects, and system dynamics, only then do we add it up together as apples to apples and see if we get to drawdown. So let's go into some details around some of the solutions. Coming in at number 10 is rooftop solar. Now I like to show this slide because again, often when we think about rooftop solar, one of the first things that comes to mind is maybe, we're in Miami, right? Maybe a warehouse covered in solar panels. Or maybe we think of a really nice house in a residential neighborhood covered with rooftop solar. But we have to remember that these are solutions that are applicable in urban and rural environments, for low and high income countries. Right? This is not an exclusive set of solutions for only rich industrialized countries. No, they're applicable across the world and have cascading benefits. This is a family living on a straw island in Lake Titicaca, installing its first solar panels. Before, kerosene was used. Kerosene on a straw island. So by installing solar, they are not only helping to reduce emissions, but they are providing safety, security, and light for their children when they go to school. It's cascading benefits here. And we have to think just also beyond electricity generation to what's coming out of our tailpipes. Direct fossil fuel combustion. This is a solution called telepresence. No more traveling by car across town or by airplanes all over the world to deliver conferences on climate change. I know. I asked if I could, they said no. But telepresence is an incredibly important solution. This replaces business air travel by allowing us to communicate in the workplace instantaneously over any distance in the world. And how we move goods and services around the world Freight, Miami is a key port of call here. About only 2 to 3% of global emissions comes from the shipping industry, but this is estimated to double or triple over the next 30 years. But there are solutions that can prevent that, can be more efficient use of that. So we can avoid up to 8 gigatons over 30 years if we have improved efficiency measures. And tropical forests, they tell their own story. Right? By protecting currently degraded land that is applicable for natural regrowth and allowing forests to be restored naturally, comes in ranked number 5. 61 gigatons of sequestered carbon. Why? Because of photosynthesis. This is drawdown in action every year, as carbon dioxide is pulled from the atmosphere and stored in plants' biomass and soil organic carbon. And we need to think about how we produce our food to make it more regenerative. Now, this is regenerative annual cropping, one of many different regenerative production solutions that we evaluate at Drawdown. This is some combination of reduced or no tillage, cover cropping, crop rotation, manure or compost application, or organic practices. We can't pick just one set of practices because some combination of these result in the regenerative component, but they're going to be practiced differently all over the world. We can't be prescriptive. We have to understand there's going to be variation. But the great thing about it is that these practices are not new. This is not an innovative way of doing things. We've been producing our food this way for generations, millennia. Smallholder farmers today still practice this. Indigenous peoples still practice this. This is how we used to produce food. But it's increasingly being replaced by modern industrial agriculture, which promotes monocropping, tillage, and the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, which degrade the land and transform it from a net sequesterer of carbon to a net emitter over time. Regenerative practices, on the other hand, do the exact opposite. They restore soil health and productivity, improve water retention, benefit smallholders by increasing yield, and also large farming operations. And guess what? It brings carbon back to the land. This is a win-win-win-win-win-win solution. There's enough wins there to, I hope everyone's saying, aha. It's a common sense solution. Moreover, and it's not just how we produce our food, but what we're consuming that is tremendously important for global warming. A plant-rich diet is not vegan or vegetarian, though I applaud anybody who's made those decisions, and I applaud Cleo for having a vegetarian and vegan lunch today. But more importantly, this is a healthy diet in terms of how much we consume overall, and particularly how much meat's consumed. In high-income countries, we vastly overconsume everything, especially meat, or animal-based proteins. In low-income countries, on the other hand, we see them struggling to feed their populations a healthy, nutrient-rich diet. That needs rebalancing. We need to reduce how much we're consuming and increase the caloric intake in low-income countries to a healthy diet. And in doing that rebalancing, a plant-rich diet becomes a number 4 solution. By avoiding all those extra emissions that are associated with overconsumption and waste. And that brings me to the next solution, food waste. About 1/3 of all food produced isn't even eaten. Think about that for just a second. 800 million people are starving in the world today, are going hungry. And yet we waste 1/3 of all food produced. And again, we have to look where along the supply chain this is happening, right? In low-income countries, where people are struggling to feed their populations, most of that food loss happens early in the supply chain, after it leaves the farm, in supply and processing and packaging and distribution to the market. Food's not wasted by consumers or markets in low-income countries where, again, are struggling to feed their populations. In high-income countries, again, the exact opposite. Most food is wasted at the end of the supply chain by consumers and consumer markets. And that wasted food ends up in the landfill and emits methane. Now, methane is about 36 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide at a 100-year timescale. At a 20-year timescale, it's closer to 86 times more potent. So if we need to make change now, we need to focus on methane in a 20-year cycle. And what that means, though, in high-income countries, is that it's not a technology problem. Right? It's a consumer choice issue. But by preventing food waste from the beginning, it becomes the number 3 solution to reversing global warming. Here's where things get real interesting about food. I love this. This is a schematic of our integration of all these different solutions and land types. And you don't need to get too into it. It's just there to look at for a sec. But what's interesting here is when we integrate the entire system, because remember, we have to do that, and we have to do all these solutions in parallel, right? That's all in parallel here. And when we do that in parallel, and we make the effort to implement all of the 13 regenerative agricultural solutions, we adopt a plant-rich diet, and we reduce our food waste. Our research shows, get this, our research shows that we would produce enough food on current farmland to feed the world's growing population now until 2050 and beyond. What does that mean? That means we don't have to cut down forests for food. The solutions to reversing global warming are the same solutions to food security and deforestation. So, is drawdown possible? The answer is yes, it is possible. We need all 80 of solutions to get us there, though. This is the 20 top solutions that I referred to earlier. I colored them to represent the different sectors. This achieves drawdown at about 2070, a long time from now. If we move farther and faster than we thought possible, the rankings shift. New solutions enter, like electric vehicles, jump there to number 19. And we achieve drawdown in 2050. If we move faster and further, more ambitiously, the rankings change again. Electric vehicles leaps to number 8. We see rankings shift. Why am I showing you this? Because the rankings don't really matter. It matters how fast and how far we adopt all of these solutions, because we need all 80 to get us to drawdown. There's no such thing as a small solution. There's no such thing as a small solution. We need all 80. But here's the really exciting thing. Thank you, I see. Here's the really exciting thing. We want these solutions whether or not global warming was even a problem, because they all have cascading benefits to human and planetary well-being. Now, if we take renewable energy generation, this results in clean, abundant access to energy for all. A plant-rich diet and reduced food waste results in enough food and sustenance for a global population. Family planning and educating girls, number 6, number 7 solution. This is about human rights and gender equality. It's about economic improvement. It's about freedom and justice. Right? Regenerative agriculture, managed grazing, tropical tree staple crops, silvopasture, restores soil health and fertility, benefits farmers, brings carbon back to the land. And by protecting our ecosystems, we're also protecting biodiversity, the oxygen that we breathe, the intrinsic value of nature and our natural resources, which are currently quickly being depleted. Its tangible benefits to all species on this planet are just incalculable. We want these solutions. We need these solutions, whether or not global warming was even an issue. But you may be asking, how much is it all going to cost? Well, I have good news for you. In addition to all these other benefits, while it's going to cost us about $29 trillion over 30 years, which is about $1 trillion per year, roughly, which seems like a lot. But when you think about the additional savings, the benefits of $74 trillion compared to what we would have to do anyway, that's a net savings of $44 trillion by implementing a system of solutions that take us to the future that we want. So, is drawdown possible? The answer is yes, it is possible. It's not going to cost that much, and there's a huge, practically incalculable return on that investment. And for those of you who are profit-oriented, you're going to make profit as well. Right? So, there's one final exciting thing I want to leave you with. Is that when we adopt this system of solutions, we change the entire way we do business. From one that is inherently exploitative and extractive to a new normal that's by nature restorative and regenerative. So we need to be rethinking our global goals and communicating a different story. We need to move beyond stabilization, beyond even sustainability, and towards regeneration. Because along the way, when we create that new regenerative way of doing business, that new normal, we get to reverse global warming and get all of those benefits along the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. It's very special to have Chad here, so we're going to open it up to about 4 questions. If anyone would like to have a question for Chad, please stand up. Okay.
On the first world country food waste, what fraction of that is domestic food, and what fraction of that is prepared foods? And as an addendum to that...
That's a good question. I don't have that answer right off the bat.
Okay, as an addendum...
Actually, that's a very good question.
As an addendum to
Process versus domestic, cool.
If we cannot effectively reduce that, how much savings can we get by handling it better? For instance, if you were to go to Waste Expo, which is one of the most weird and amazing conferences on the planet, this year Waste Expo was all about turning food waste into syngas and using it to make electricity.
Well, I guess if your question is about how much waste happens at the point of processing and packaging, again, that was your question. Maybe I misunderstood it. That's different based on high-income or low-income countries, based on different regions, essentially part of the world. In lower-income countries, it tends
No, you were very clear about that. I want to know about sort of the first world country issue of food wastage on the consumption side. Because if we're looking around the room at the things that we can begin addressing, we're living in a first world country that's clearly wasting food on the consumption side. So I'm thinking, what can we do?
Okay, good. Thank you for that. So there's lots of things people can do. We don't tend to be prescriptive at Drawdown because everyone makes their choices themselves. But as a first order, it's about understanding what you purchase and purchasing what you intend to be consuming. Right? And that goes along the way from when you're going to the market, buying less on a daily basis. Right? You don't need to stock up our fridges and our freezers and our cupboards with as much food as we could possibly store to make it look nice and make sure we have something available whenever we need it, because we end up wasting a lot of it. It's about using what you have and not letting things go to waste. It's about when you go out to a restaurant, ordering a fair amount and then taking what you can back. It's about, there's lots of other ways we can do it, even at market. So if we take, for example, restaurants. There are studies that show that plate size makes a difference in sort of in consumers' happiness at the end of their meal. So you can have the same quantity of food, and if you put it on a big plate, people end up being dissatisfied. Right? If you put it on a smaller plate, people feel more satisfied at the end of the meal. And we know satisfied customers are really what restaurants are looking for. So there's ways that we can have nudges towards that companies and people who are in the restaurant world who can take an active role in this, but also we as consumers can make the choices that we make when we purchase an item, make sure we consume it, and of course taking things back and actually planning for utilization of that extra food rather than letting it go straight to the bin. There's many other things, and I can point you some sources that will have much more detail on things that you can take on.
Thank you, Chad.
Yes, my name is Eric Swally. I'd like to talk about energy transition. We live on a water-covered planet, and my idea is to transition to a hydrogen economy, to take all of the non-carbon renewables, and they can all mainly from seawater. We need to fight seawater with seawater and use it as our source of energy.
Yeah. I'm sorry, was that a question or a comment?
Yes, I think that this would be the thing we need to concentrate on is
absolutely
transition toward a hydrogen economy.
Absolutely. So when we do our analysis at Drawdown, you'll see the rankings are and the numbers in our book are only reflective of existing those 80 existing technologies and practices. Hydrogen, you're absolutely right, I think is a really important solution. I would categorize that as one of the innovations that needs to become more economically viable before it can really start scaling at a global level. That doesn't also mean that in certain applications in different parts of the world that we can be adopting that now. So you don't see it on that list of solutions because of that purpose, because of that reason, because it's not, I wouldn't think that it is currently economically viable for global scaling yet. It's very close and needs to happen. So I agree with you very much there. I think it's great. And I should also say one of the additional components to our model, so I didn't go into great detail, I don't have the time, but we do look at several different types of models that look at markets of demand, that look at food systems, that look at land. And the one piece that we're actually just developing are ocean-based technologies and practices for our next iteration of our research, which we hope to come out at the end of this year. You'll see entirely new results and new solutions along the way. And we'll include some of this stuff as well, particularly your relation to seawater and hydrogen.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just had a question in terms of the research and the model. What are you guys thinking in terms of addressing the opposing forces, mostly from the political perspective or in terms of human behavior that would make the solutions working together at the same time not doable, the opposing forces, if you know what I mean?
Well, that's a good point. In terms of our modeling and our research, we do not actually take that into account as a function of these of the modeling itself, because it's really hard to quantify that. That's not a, it ends up being an assumption based and not a data-driven approach. So we focus on the data itself, and we focus on how different adoption trajectories can happen and the different trade-offs that occur. But in terms of our overall approach, we feel very strongly that we need to change the way we discuss, the way we talk about climate solutions, get this information out there, and create tools. Atmospheric models, though those are incredibly valuable. Indeed, the data that comes from these more academic models, if you will, that enters into our analysis. Because we wanted to create something that was eminently meaningful. Now, we all know the old adage, all models are wrong. And ours are definitely wrong. But some are useful. And I like to think a very few are useful and meaningful. And that's what Drawdown's models are, as decision support tools to help us get along that pathway to what is possible at different scales. Now, what we looked at here was phase one of our work. Now, phase one looks at the global systems approach. And there's only so much we can say about different political mechanisms or financial mechanisms, policy mechanisms, or educational platforms for behavior change at a global scale. Frankly, barring some sort of higher power that comes down with a carbon tax on everybody on this planet, I don't think we can do it from a global approach. We need to have this from a contextual scale, from different regions, and coming from the bottom up. So our phase two, after first setting the stage and a framework of analysis that looks at the global system, phase two, we're embarking on regionalization of the model through a distributed network of researchers all over the world. And that's when we can start adding on things like accelerators. Because policy mechanisms and financial mechanisms aren't solutions. No policy is going to reduce emissions. A policy is going to increase the uptake of a technology or practice that reduces emissions or sequesters carbon. No financial mechanism itself a transaction on your, except for maybe blockchain, and we can get some efficiencies there, but no financial transaction on the system is going to itself cause reduction in emissions. It will accelerate the adoption of those solutions. So we make a distinction between accelerators and solutions. And when we start to look at regional or contextual analyses, then these accelerators become relevant because they're relevant at scale, right? And we also, at that time, can not only look at these accelerators, like policies and so on, we can also attribute different additional impacts, like economic or planetary impacts to these solutions as well. So we can look at ecosystem services. We can look at health outcomes, jobs, etc. Again, there's no global prescription that's going to work. We have to do that from the regional or contextual scale. That's when these solutions become meaningful in terms of how we can adopt them and what are the additional cascading benefits at scale.
Thank you, Chad.
Hi, Lynn Paisley from Mast Academy.
Hi.
I wonder if you see any realistic role for climate engineering or for carbon scrubbing in Drawdown.
No.
Okay.
And then our last question.
I mean, I'm open to anything, but at this point, no.
Maybe just to carry the previous question just a little further, just to maybe sharpen it a little bit. This is a little reminiscent of the UN's sustainability goals.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you would see this being potentially more successful, because obviously the success of that has been very limited, and how you might see yourself doing better than that.
Well, I think the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, I spent, over a decade in the world of sustainability, sustainable development specifically. And they're incredibly valuable that we are actually having a new framework to look at and to analyze and to think about achieving these sustainable development goals. But you're right, they're not actionable in many ways. And I think looking at these set of solutions, which are mapped very, very closely and very aligned to these set of through these cascading benefits to almost all of the sustainable development goals. You achieve this, you achieve sustainable development goals. What this does is it creates a compendium of actual technologies and practices to get us there. So you can go open up this book or go to our website or dive deep into our tools, and you can find a decision support tool that says, here's a portfolio of technology and practices that can actually get us to achieve some of these goals. Now, what I would also suggest, now this might be...
Maybe just to sharpen it just a little more, is to say, why don't you think the sustainability development goals haven't done so well? Is it just that? Is that they didn't have any practical solutions like that?
I wouldn't say necessarily how they have. I mean, it's still early on before we can determine whether they've been successful or not in motivating people to achieve things. I think that as a motivating principle, alongside things like Project Drawdown and other organizations that are putting out great work on different solutions to get us there. And again, there's many people who are working in this space, and we never want to reinvent the wheel, right? What I always say is I like to take the wheel off of one vehicle and put it onto the Drawdown framework so that we can benefit from each other, right? Hopefully, preferably an electric vehicle, or even better, like a high-speed rail. That would be cool. But we want to move towards that and work together along the way. And that means like the Sustainable Development Goals don't have to happen in isolation. Great framework to start with, but let's get a bunch of other organizations working on implementation at the policy scale, financial mechanisms, etc., as well as the technologies and practices, and work together across different ecosystems. So that's how we can cross-pollinate and get there. But one thing I would also suggest, and I have suggested this to folks at the UN, we may want to rethink, or at least envision what the next step is from the Sustainable Development Goals, and start thinking about regenerative development goals, right? So not just working in a system of sustainability where we're sustaining a way of doing business that is inherently actually inequitable. And if we solve some of those inequities, they're the trade-offs in a sustainable world if we don't actually shift the system. So we need to also think about how we can eventually move to shifting the system to more, like as I said, more regenerative and restorative goals that are in alignment with the SDGs, but maybe we need to go beyond that.